April 1943. The North Atlantic Ocean was not a shipping lane. It was a graveyard. For 3 years, the lifeline between North America and Great Britain had been severed by the most efficient killing machine in naval history, the German U-boat force. In the first 20 days of March alone, Allied shipping losses had reached catastrophic levels. 108 ships, 627,000 tons of vital war material, food, fuel, ammunition, and steel sent to the bottom of the freezing ocean. In London, Winston Churchill confided to his diary that the U-boat peril was the only thing that ever truly frightened him. The mathematics of the war were simple and terrifying. Britain was starving. If the supply lines could not be secured, the Allied invasion of Europe would be impossible. The United Kingdom would be forced to negotiate a peace, and the war would be lost. The architects of this destruction sat in a concrete bunker in Lorient, France, led by Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz. Dönitz had perfected a tactic that baffled Allied defenders, the Rudeltaktik, or Wolfpack. Instead of operating as solitary hunters, German submarines gathered in groups of 20 or 30, spread across hundreds of miles of ocean in patrol lines. When one boat spotted a convoy, it didn't attack, it shadowed. It radioed the position to the others. And like wolves responding to a howl, the pack converged. They attacked at night, on the surface, where their low silhouettes made them invisible, and their diesel engines gave them speed superior to most escorts. They struck from multiple angles simultaneously, overwhelming the defenders, tearing the convoy apart, and vanishing before dawn. The Allied response to this slaughter had been desperate and largely ineffective. Escort commanders were fighting a defensive war, reacting to attacks that had already happened. They chased sonar ghosts and dropped depth charges that exploded harmlessly deep underwater, while the U-boats maneuvered on the surface. The hunters held every advantage. They dictated the time, the place, and the method of the battle. Washington and London were running out of ideas, and more importantly, they were running out of time. Military planners estimated that the Allied merchant fleet could sustain these losses for perhaps another 6 months before the entire logistics chain collapsed. But deep within the command structure of the U.S. Navy, an obscure officer named James Sullivan was working on a solution that his superiors would call suicidal. Sullivan was an anomaly in the officer corps. He was not an Annapolis graduate. He did not come from a lineage of admirals. He was 42 years old, a former shipyard welder from Boston who had spent his youth crawling through the double hulls of unfinished battleships, inhaling fumes and welding steel plates. He had earned his commission the hard way, through night schools and sheer, stubborn grit. He didn't think like a naval aristocrat. He thought like a blue-collar problem solver. By early 1943, Sullivan commanded Destroyer Squadron 185, a group of Fletcher-class destroyers assigned to the thankless task of convoy escort. To his crews, he was a quiet, intense man who spent his off-duty hours not at the officers' club, but hunched over charts in his cabin, moving paper models of ships across a table. His executive officer once found him at 3 in the morning, staring at a diagram of a Wolfpack attack, muttering about angles of convergence. Sullivan had realized something that the Admiralty had missed. The Wolfpack tactic relied on a specific geometry. The submarines had to converge on a central point. The current Allied doctrine tried to prevent this convergence by pushing the U-boats out. Sullivan wondered what would happen if he did the opposite. What if he invited them in? What if he deliberately created the perfect target, a vulnerable, damaged straggler, and allowed the Wolfpack to surround it? It was a concept of breathtaking audacity. Turn the convoy defense inside out. Instead of a shield, he would create a trap. Sullivan had spent months studying the reports of British Captain Frederick John Walker, the Royal Navy's most successful submarine hunter. Walker had pioneered the creeping attack, where one ship held sonar contact while another moved in for the kill. Sullivan wanted to take this concept and scale it up to a squadron level. He envisioned a coordinated multi-ship assault that would strike in all directions simultaneously. But to make it work, he needed the enemy to be close, terrifyingly close. He needed the U-boats to believe they had cornered easy prey. He needed them to surface and encircle his destroyers, cutting off their own escape routes without realizing it. When Sullivan finally presented this plan to his captains in a smoke-filled briefing room in Halifax, the silence was deafening. Lieutenant Commander Michael Chen, a brilliant tactician who had served on submarines before the war, was the first to speak. He pointed out the obvious flaw. Allowing 8 or 10 U-boats to surround 5 destroyers was practically inviting a massacre. They would be in the center of a torpedo spread coming from every point on the compass. Sullivan's response was calm and chilling. He argued that the Germans were rigid in their doctrine. They expected convoys to scatter. They expected escorts to run toward the first explosion. If the Americans did neither, if they sat still, played dead, and then exploded into action with synchronized violence, the German commanders would freeze. For those few critical minutes of confusion, the hunters would become the hunted. Sullivan acknowledged the risk. He admitted that if the timing was off by even 30 seconds, his ships would be sent to the bottom. But he also pointed to the tonnage reports from the previous month. The current strategy was failing. They were losing the war by inches. It was time to gamble. His captains, men who had watched too many merchant ships burn and sink, slowly nodded. They were tired of playing defense. They were ready to hunt. The plan required approval from the top, and that meant facing Admiral Jonas Richardson, the commander of the Western Atlantic Escort Forces. The meeting took place in a secure office in Norfolk, Virginia. Richardson listened for 20 minutes without interrupting as Sullivan laid out the inverse ambush concept. When Sullivan finished, the admiral sat back, lighting a cigarette with a steady hand. He told Sullivan bluntly that the plan was insane. It violated every principle of naval warfare. It risked 5 modern destroyers and nearly 2,000 men on a hunch. But Richardson also knew the reality of the Atlantic. He knew that Donitz was winning. He looked at the former Welder and told him that he could not order men to execute such a suicide mission. It had to be voluntary. Sullivan didn't hesitate. He told the admiral that his ship was named after the 5 Sullivan brothers who died together at Guadalcanal. His men knew the stakes. They would volunteer. Richardson granted permission on one condition. Sullivan had 10 days to prove the tactics worked in a live-fire exercise. If there was a single collision, a single communication breakdown, the mission was scrubbed. The next 10 days were a blur of exhaustion and adrenaline. Sullivan took his squadron, USS Bainbridge, USS Harper, USS Montgomery, USS Thornton, and his flagship, USS Sullivan, to a remote testing ground off the coast of Maine. They requisitioned an old training submarine to play the rabbit. The core of Sullivan's tactic relied on a new secret weapon, the Hedgehog. Traditional depth charges were clumsy instruments. They were large drums of explosives dropped off the stern that detonated at a preset depth. They created massive turbulence that blinded the attacking ship's sonar for minutes, allowing the U-boat to escape. The Hedgehog was different. It was a spigot mortar system mounted on the bow of the destroyer. It fired a pattern of 24 small, 65-pound projectiles ahead of the ship. Crucially, these warheads were contact-fused. They would only explode if they physically hit the submarine's hull. If they missed, they sank silently to the bottom, leaving the water undisturbed and the sonar contact clear. A hit with a Hedgehog wasn't just damage, it was usually a kill. But aiming them required mathematical precision. The destroyer had to run directly over the U-boat's predicted position. Day after day, night after night, the squadron practiced. They drilled until the crews were sleepwalking. They practiced silent communication, using signal lamps and infrared blinkers instead of radios, which the Germans could intercept. They developed a complex choreography of movement, where 5 ships maneuvered in tight formation in pitch darkness. The margin for error was 0. A collision at high speed would sink them just as surely as a German torpedo. The crews grumbled, the officers frayed, but Sullivan was relentless. He was everywhere, in the sonar room, on the bridge, in the engine room, checking calculations, correcting angles, demanding perfection. On the 7th night, during a full dress rehearsal with live observers from the Admiralty, the squadron executed the maneuver. They simulated a distress call, lured the target vessels in, and then unleashed a coordinated attack. It was a ballet of destruction. Every simulated target was neutralized within 45 minutes. The observers were stunned. Admiral Richardson, reading the report, reportedly muttered, "God help those U-boats." The green light was given. Intelligence from Bletchley Park, utilizing ultra-intercepts, had identified a massive concentration of U-boats forming in the mid-Atlantic air gap, the area beyond the reach of Allied patrol planes. Admiral Donitz was assembling a Wolfpack of 23 submarines to intercept convoy HX-234, a critical supply run of 67 merchant ships. The intercepts indicated that 8 of these U-boats were forming the southern patrol line, holding rigid station coordinates. It was the perfect target. Sullivan's squadron would not be escorting the convoy. They would be the bait. They would sail ahead of the merchants, posing as a straggling group of damaged ships, and sail directly into the teeth of the southern line. On April 22, 1943, Destroyer Squadron 185 slipped out of Halifax Harbor. They looked like any other greyhounds of the sea, battered by salt and rust, but inside, they were coiled springs. The crews wrote their last letters home. They checked their life vests. They sharpened their knives. As the coast of North America faded into the fog behind them, Captain Sullivan addressed his men over the intercom. He didn't offer platitudes about glory. He spoke with the blunt honesty of a man who had worked with his hands all his life. He told them that they were sailing into a trap, but they were the ones who would spring it. He told them that the German submarine crews believed they were the hunters, supreme and untouchable. "In 48 hours, Sullivan said, his voice crackling over the speakers, "we are going to teach them what it feels like to be prey." The squadron pushed into the open Atlantic, the waves rising to meet them. The weather was deteriorating, a classic North Atlantic gale brewing, which would mask their approach but make the operation infinitely more dangerous. Below decks, the sonar operators sat in their dark, red-lit booths, listening to the static of the ocean, waiting for the distinct, rhythmic pulse of a propeller or the ping of an echo. Above them, the gunnery crews huddled in their parkas, chipping ice off the Hedgehog mounts. They were sailing toward a precise coordinate on a chart, a patch of empty ocean where 8 German commanders were waiting. The plan relied on a deception so complete it bordered on theater. At 1800 hours on April 23rd, USS Bainbridge began the performance. Her radio operator tapped out a distress signal on the International Maritime Frequency, unencrypted, begging to be heard. "Mayday, Mayday! This is merchant tanker Duntroon. Severe storm damage, rudder jammed, fuel leak. Request immediate assistance. Position 48 north, 35 west." The message was a lie. The Duntroon didn't exist. The signal was originating from a heavily armed destroyer masquerading as a helpless victim. 300 meters beneath the surface and scattered across 10 miles of ocean, the German hydrophone operators picked up the signal. In the cramped, sweating confines of U-309, Kapitän Lieutenant Klaus Hartmann was ending his watch. He was a veteran ace, a man who wore the Knight's Cross at his throat. When the radio man handed him the intercept, Hartmann smiled. A damaged tanker, straggling, weak escorts. It was the kind of target every U-boat commander dreamed of. He checked his charts. The target was close. He wasn't the only one listening. Across the dark waters, 7 other U-boat commanders, aggressive, hungry, and confident, were making the same calculation. Standard Wolfpack doctrine was clear: converge and destroy. One by one, the gray wolves turned their bows toward the source of the signal. They began to surface, their diesel engines roaring to life to close the distance at maximum speed. They thought they were racing toward a kill. They had no way of knowing they were racing toward James Sullivan, and he was waiting for them with the patience of a man who knows exactly how to weld a trap shut. The stage was set for the most intense 4 hours of naval combat in the history of the Atlantic. The Atlantic night was absolute. There was no moon, only the crushing weight of the dark and the rhythmic, heaving chest of the ocean. Aboard the 5 destroyers of Squadron 185, the silence was physical. Men stood at their battle stations, freezing spray crusting on their eyelashes, their hands gripping cold steel. They were not running dark, they were running dim, deliberately showing just enough light to mimic the careless desperation of a damaged merchant convoy. On the bridge of the USS Bainbridge, Commander James Sullivan watched the radar scope. The green sweep line rotated hypnotically, painting the reality of their situation. 8 distinct blips. 8 predators closing the circle. They were coming from all points of the compass, north, south, east, west, drawn by the fake distress calls like sharks to blood in the water. To a traditional naval tactician, this was a death sentence. To be surrounded by a Wolfpack was to be already dead. But Sullivan wasn't looking for an escape route. He was checking his watch. It was 22:58. The range to the nearest U-boat was 4,000 yards and closing. They were on the surface, confident, arrogant, charging batteries and preparing for what they thought would be a turkey shoot. In the conning tower of U-309, Captain Lieutenant Klaus Hartmann raised his binoculars. He could see the shadowy outlines of the American ships rolling in the swell. They looked sluggish, vulnerable. He ordered his torpedo tubes flooded. "Nos," he whispered to himself, anticipating the fiery geysers that would mark another tonnage victory for the Reich. He had no idea that 3,000 yards away, a fire control officer on the Bainbridge had just locked a director onto his exact bearing. The trap was not just set. The jaws were already closing. At 2300 hours exactly, Sullivan grabbed the handset of the squawk box. His voice was flat, devoid of theatrics. "Execute." The ocean instantly turned into day. 20 high-intensity carbon arc searchlights snapped on simultaneously across the 5 destroyers. The beams stabbed through the darkness with blinding violence, pinning the gray hulls of the U-boats against the black water like insects on a display board. The psychological shock was devastating. German lookouts, their eyes adapted to the pitch black, were instantly blinded, screaming and throwing their hands up to shield their faces. For those few seconds, the German command structure collapsed into panic. This wasn't supposed to happen. Prey didn't carry searchlights. Prey didn't turn to fight. On U-309, Hartmann screamed the order that every submariner dreads. "Alarm! Alarm! Dive!" The klaxon howled, and the submarine pitched forward, its bow biting into the waves as the ballast tanks flooded. But physics is a cruel mistress. A 700-ton Type 7 U-boat takes nearly 30 seconds to vanish beneath the surface. Hartmann needed 30 seconds. Sullivan gave him 10. The USS Bainbridge didn't turn away. She surged forward, her turbines screaming as she accelerated to attack speed. On her bow, the Hedgehog mount swiveled. The gunnery officer waited for the roll of the ship, timed the heave of the ocean, and fired. There was no bang, only a ripple of hollow thumps as 24 projectiles were hurled into the air in a perfect elliptical pattern. They splashed into the water ahead of the diving submarine, sinking rapidly. Inside U-309, the crew heard the splashes, a terrifying sound like hail on a tin roof. They held their breath, praying for the depth charges to miss. But these weren't depth charges. 7 seconds later, One of the contact-fused projectiles struck the steel pressure hull just aft of the conning tower. The explosion was instantaneous and catastrophic. The shaped charge punched a hole through the steel plate, and the ocean rushed in with the force of a hydraulic hammer. The shockwave detonated the submarine's own torpedo warheads. A massive geyser of white water and debris erupted from the surface, followed by a spreading slick of diesel oil. U-309 didn't sink. It disintegrated. 48 men were erased from existence before they even understood they were under attack. To the east, the USS Harper had engaged U-417. The German commander, Oberleutnant Wolfgang Schneider, made a fatal error. Instead of diving, he tried to fight it out on the surface, ordering his crew to man the 88mm deck gun. It was a courageous, suicidal gesture. The Harper's 5-inch forward guns opened fire at point-blank range. The first salvo fell short, throwing up walls of water that swamped the U-boat's deck. The second salvo was a direct hit. A 50-pound high-explosive shell slammed into the base of the conning tower, vaporizing the bridge crew and turning the submarine's command center into a twisted ruin of jagged metal. As the U-boat wallowed, burning and helpless, the Harper crossed its T and unleashed a full Hedgehog pattern. The projectiles rained down on the crippled boat. 8 hits. The submarine broke in two, the bow and stern rising vertically out of the water like tombstones before sliding beneath the waves. The battle had dissolved into a chaotic, terrifying melee. The Wolfpack had been shattered. The hunters were now frantically scattering, diving, trying to escape the circle of light and fire. On the USS Montgomery, Lieutenant Commander Jackson faced the most complex tactical problem. 2 U-boats, U-608 and U-521, were attacking from the south quadrant. Jackson didn't flinch. He ordered his batteries to split fire. The aft guns hammered U-608, keeping it pinned on the surface, while the ship maneuvered to engage U-521, which was crash diving. U-608 took 3 hits to her fuel bunkers. The submarine turned into a blazing torch, the flames illuminating the desperate figures of sailors jumping into the freezing Atlantic. But U-521 was different. Commanded by the ace Dieter Krauss, it had slipped beneath the surface seconds before the shells arrived. Krauss was good. He immediately went deep and silent, turning hard to port to confuse the sonar. This was the moment Sullivan's doctrine was built for. The Montgomery didn't chase blindly. She slowed. She began the creeping attack. Her sonar pinged into the depths, a high-pitched metallic ping, ping, that echoed off the steel hull of the hidden boat. Aboard the USS Thornton, racing in from the flank, the sonar operator picked up the contact. Target bearing 270, depth 400 feet, moving slow. The 2 destroyers coordinated their movements without speaking a word over the radio, using signal lamps to triangulate the kill zone. Krauss was trapped in a 3-dimensional box of sound. He tried to go deeper, past the test depth of his boat, the hull groaning under the immense pressure. But he couldn't outrun the math. Both destroyers fired their Hedgehogs simultaneously. 48 warheads descended through the dark water. U-521 took 12 hits. The implosion was registered on sonar buoys 5 miles away, a sickening, crunching sound as the ocean crushed the vessel like a soda can. The battle raged for 4 hours. It was a systematic dismantling of the German force. U-496 was caught on the surface by the Bainbridge and rammed, the destroyer's steel prow slicing through the pressure hull. U-533 was caught at periscope depth by a combined attack from Harper and Thornton. U-724 tried to run on the surface and was chased down by Sullivan's own flagship. In a move of aggressive brilliance, Sullivan ordered a torpedo spread against the submarine, a weapon usually reserved for capital ships. The second torpedo struck the U-boat's screws, blowing the stern off. The submarine sank stern first, her bow pointing accusingly at the stars. By 0300 hours, only one U-boat remained, U-615, commanded by Otto Schneider. Schneider was a survivor. He had dived immediately, cut his engines, and laid his boat on a thermal layer at 500 feet, drifting silently with the current. He was playing dead, hoping the Americans would assume he had escaped or sunk. Above him, the destroyers prowled, their sonar pulses sweeping the ocean. For 30 minutes, there was only the sound of the ship's screws churning the water. Sullivan refused to break off. "He's down there," Sullivan told his bridge crew. "He's waiting for us to get bored. We don't get bored." He ordered the squadron to form a picket line and conduct a slow-speed sweep. It was Chief Petty Officer Mike Anderson aboard the Bainbridge who heard it, a faint metallic clank over the hydrophones, a dropped wrench, a hatch closing too hard, a mistake. "Contact," Anderson whispered. "Bearing 185, weak, deep." The squadron converged. They didn't rush. They moved with the terrifying patience of executioners. Schneider heard the screw noises getting louder, merging into a roar directly overhead. He realized too late that his silence had become his tomb. The final Hedgehog volley was massive, a concentrated barrage from 3 ships. U-615 never stood a chance. The explosions ripped the boat apart, sending a final bubble of oil and air to the surface. At 0307, silence returned to the North Atlantic. The searchlights were doused, the guns cooled. The ocean, indifferent to the violence, rolled on. Sullivan walked out onto the wing of the bridge. The air smelled of cordite, diesel fuel, and the metallic tang of blood. The water around them was littered with debris, corks, life jackets, oil slicks, and the few survivors clinging to wreckage. Sullivan ordered the rescue nets deployed. This was the paradox of the sailor. You spent 4 hours trying to kill a man, and the next 4 trying to save him from the sea. They pulled 46 Germans from the water. These were not the arrogant supermen of the propaganda posters. They were shivering, oil-soaked boys, retching seawater, their eyes wide with the shock of being alive when everyone they knew was dead. Sullivan watched them come aboard. He didn't feel triumph. He felt a heavy, cold exhaustion. He went to the radio room and dictated a message to Halifax, encrypted "Flash Priority." Engagement complete. 8 enemy submarines destroyed. All own ships undamaged, returning to base. The Sullivan ambush changed the war. When Admiral Dönitz received the reports of the total loss of his southern patrol line, the psychological blow was heavier than the tactical one. The U-boat arm had lost its invisibility. The hunters had become the prey. The exchange rate of the Atlantic War had flipped overnight. For the first time, German crews left port believing they would not come back. Sullivan's tactics became the standard curriculum for Allied navies. The Hedgehog became the scythe that cleared the Atlantic. But for James Sullivan, the victory was private and painful. He would spend the rest of his life remembering not the medals, but the faces of the men he killed, the terrible cost of keeping the lifeline open. He had proven that a welder from Boston could outthink the admirals of the Third Reich, but he never bragged about it. He knew that in the end, the ocean claims everyone. He had just decided who went first. The trap had worked. The wolves were dead. And the dawn was coming up over a sea that was, for the first time in 3 years, safe.